Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 11th of June of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kharkiv direction, but before we start, I would like to point your attention that according to the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours lost significant number of the manpower. According to the Russians, the total losses of the Ukrainians were around 2,155 soldiers. This is the new record since the beginning of the special military operation. Of course, it's up to you to believe or not these numbers. As for me, I'm using these numbers to understand the, let's say, the current situation and where exactly the current situation is moving. Because when talking about the numbers of losses and about the situation on the ground, about additional gains by the Russians, I see that there is a real connection between the, let's say, updates, the Russian progress, and the level of losses. Now let's start and let's talk about Gluboko. During the previous few days, we were talking a lot about the Ukrainian attacks, let's say from Liptsy in direction of Gluboko from the southwestern directions. Those attacks mainly were conducted by the Ukrainians 42nd Mechanized Brigade, but all those attempts to attacks were repelled by the Russians. The Ukrainians suffered significant losses, and now according to the Group of Forces North, the Ukrainians are forced, let's say, to redeploy this brigade, this battalion, for replenish losses. It was written in the report of, let's say, Group of Forces North. So, according to them, Gluboko was under attack of the 30th Brigade of the National Guard of Ukraine, which replaced the 2nd Battalion of the 42nd Mechanized Brigade, which was crushed by Russian fighters and withdrawn to replenish losses. So, as of today, the Ukrainians by the 13th Brigade were trying to attack the Russians from Liptsy, from the southeastern part, but those attacks also were repelled by the Russians. We have geolocations confirming this. We will not watch the video till the end because there were lots of episodes of the violence. So once again, to summarize, Liptsy direction, 1 battalion, 2nd Battalion of 42nd Mechanized Brigade was already defeated and removed from the line of combat contact to restore its combat capabilities. Now the Ukrainians are using 30th Brigade. Most likely within a week, this brigade or some battalions of this brigade will lose its combat capabilities as well. On the other hand, we see that the Russians continue reporting about additional progress and additional updates about the fields that located to the west of Zelyone, and most likely the Russians captured some territories in this area, yet we haven't received any geolocations confirming this. The only thing we have is that the second day in a row the Russians are talking just about attempts to attack the territory and about additional progress on this direction. Now let's move further to the west in direction of Volchansk. We have a lot of updates from this territory as well. The Russians are saying that they began storming the aggregatny plant and that there are currently very heavy clashes for the main office. I tried to search on the Google Maps the main office of the aggregatny plant, but haven't found, so that's why I can't tell you for sure where exactly the main clashes are taking place. But if the Russians start giving us some details and updates about very certain buildings, that means that the battle for aggregatny plant is about to be finished. On the other hand, we continue receiving reports that Ukrainians continue counterattack the Russians in the eastern and the northeastern part of the northern Vovchansk, and these are the main roads. Those were the main roads of Ukraine attacks during the previous 48 hours. And according to the Russians, those attacks were conducted by the forces of 36th Marine Brigade, and the Russians reported that during those attacks the Ukrainians used around 60 soldiers, but when the Ukrainians entered the line of combat contact, the Russians start bombing and attacking them with total and tower systems. And as a result of those counterattacks, the Ukrainians were defeated and were forced to fall back. I'll remind you that according to the sources of open source information, the 36th Marine Brigade was transferred to the northern Vovchansk with the purpose to replace 82nd Brigade, 82nd Air Mobile Brigade, that also lost its combat capabilities as a result of clashes for the north of Vovchansk. Furthermore, we got reports that those who managed to survive from the 82nd Brigade, not of course from entire, but from the second, probably the first battalion of that brigade, were redeployed to Chuguyev, and during the previous 24 hours, the Russian sources report about Iskander strikes in direction of this, let's say, town. Most likely, the Russians were targeting those evacuated soldiers. When talking about Vovchansk, to summarize everything, as you can see, we have no changes on the ground. We have just few geolocations of how the Russians were bombing and pummeling the territory heavily. And once again, there were no changes on the ground. Just a lot of reports about significant numbers of Ukrainian battalions who have already lost their combat capabilities. Now let's move to the northern Kupiansk direction. We have lots of updates, and northern Kupiansk direction is making new records. Because concerning of this brigade, when let's say we were talking about this brigade in January, February, March, the average level of loss of the armed forces of Ukraine on this direction were around 50, 60, 70 soldiers, 70, let's say, personnel per day. But let's say in the case of June and May, the average level of losses of the armed forces of Ukraine on this direction varies from 400 per day till 500 per day. And today the Ukrainians got another record on this direction. They lost more than 500 soldiers, more than one battalion. During the previous 24 hours, we haven't received any updates about any brigades that lost its combat capabilities, but most likely the 43rd Mechanized Brigade is about to lose its combat capabilities, and maybe some brigades of 77s or 103rd or 115th. Now let's talk about details. According to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, as a result of clashes, the Russians captured the village by the name of Tabaevka, as I remember, Timkovka. So if you try to find this village on the Google map, you will not be able to do this, because this village was abandoned and closed in 1987. Now this is just a sign on the map, just the area, just some point on the map which give us some understanding of the edge Russian positions on the line of combat contact. So this small square was captured by the Russians during the previous 24 hours. Also, we got reports, and as you can see, we have adjusted the map between Stepovo, Novoselovka and Ivanovka. If you remember, during the previous few days, the Russians were attacking the village Stepovo, Novoselovka from the north, and as a result of that attack, the Russians entered the east tree line. Furthermore, the Russians made lots of attempts to clear the main road between Ivanovka and Stepovo, Novoselovka, between the villages in the central part. The Russians were clearing and demining this territory with drones. Furthermore, we discussed just yesterday the Russians brought the distance demining equipment Zmei Gorыныch or Ur-77, but Ukrainians destroyed that equipment with FPV drone strikes, and we were expecting for additional Russian progress on the south, in the southern direction. And today we got the first geolocations confirming that the Russians, as a result of offensive, established complete control over the southern part of the tree line. We got the geolocation. The video was published by the Ukrainian source site. We will not watch this video because there are lots of episodes of violence. So the Russians were moving something like this, and they managed to reach this point. Most likely, the Russians during the previous 24 hours established complete control over entire tree line, but we haven't received geolocations. But I believe that something like this happened during a previous day. So we see that the Russians are about to start the final battle for Stepovo, Novoselovka. Meanwhile, the Russians were bombing the territory heavily, so maybe 2-3 days, maybe 4 days, maybe 5, maybe a week, and this village will be captured by the Russians as well. So as you can see, significant progress, and this progress completely corresponds to the losses of the armed forces of Ukraine that were stated by the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation. Now let's move to this. In the southern direction, we have lots of updates from the villages by the name of Stelmakhovka, Mesozharevka and Rozovka. According to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, the Russians established complete control over this territory. We have adjusted the area, we have adjusted the map and colored this territory in red. Also, There are a few important things. There are two sources that reported anything about this direction. For example, since the beginning of the battle for this area, for Stelmakhovka, Mesazharevka, and Rozovka, we haven't received even a single video confirming the Russian presence inside of any of these villages. We just received some updates from different sources, and we had the Ministry of Defense report. So when the Russians were talking about complete control of Mesazharevka, and it happened somewhere in the end of May, we haven't received any updates from the Ministry of Defense. And 2 weeks later, so today on the 11th of June, the Russians report about complete control. But the sources that were talking about Mesazharevka 2 weeks ago, today reported that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, established complete control over the village by the name of Andreevka, or the Russians are calling this village by the name of Rozovka. So significant progress, as you can see, during the previous few weeks. And now this situation, this configuration, give us lots of ideas where the Russians are planning to move further. We were expecting that the Russians would try to attack Stelmakhovka from the north, from the line Berestova to this in the southern direction to Stelmakhovka, maybe from Novoselovska in the same direction. But today we see that the Russians are moving from Mesazharovka to the southwest in direction of Vishnyovo. So all these things give us understanding that most likely the Russians do have some plans to renew their attempts to attack on the line Ragorodka, Nadia, Pershatravneva. So they will try to take this territory into pincers and to collapse another defense belt. Now let's move further to the south. In the southern direction we have Siversk, and as you can see we have significant number of geolocations and lots of very interesting updates. The Russians continue destroying and attacking Ukrainian positions in Belogorovka direction. We have few more videos of TOS flamethrower strikes, and these videos are not the only video from this direction since the beginning of months. We have lots of, let's say, videos of how the Russians were bombing and pummeling the territory. So most likely during the next few days, the Russians will renew their offensive in this area, trying to cut everything, to cut this artillery pocket and to establish complete control over the territory. But the most important updates are coming from the village by the name of Verkhnikayanska. Today the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, according to unconfirmed resources, managed to establish complete control over this stronghold. This territory, this area was captured by the Russians, yet we haven't received even a single geolocated confirmation, but probably this is exactly what happened during the previous day. And if it's true, then the Russians now can begin offensive further to the west and can attack Verkhnikayanska from the east. And this is the main defense belt, the main stronghold between Siversk and Russian forces. And if the Russians somehow are able to capture the entire village and to get the western outskirts of the settlement, then they're going to start bombing and attacking the Siversk itself. Of course, the Russians already bomb and attack Siversk. For example, on this video we can see arrival of another DAP 1500, as you can see, significant explosion. We have lots of videos of counter-artillery duels, how the Russians were hunting and destroying the Ukrainian forces and positions with accurate strikes. Lots of warehouses, artillery systems, howitzers were destroyed. Most of those attacks the Russians made to slow down the Ukrainians and not to allow them to bring additional reinforcements to the stronghold on the eastern part of Verkhnikayanska, while the main Russian forces were storming the territory. Now we are moving further to the south. In the southern direction we have Sporne. As you can see, another day, another significant number of geolocations. The Russians are reducing the village till ruins. Probably the Russians start bombing not just the ruins, but probably the underground, some facilities or something like this. Lots of strikes, lots of explosions, lots of geolocations, lots of videos from this area, but we still haven't received any updates about any attempts from the Russian side to capture this territory. The number of weapons, the number of explosions we see from this area, even more than the number of explosions and videos we receive from, let's say, Volchansk, where the Russians have let's say a certain goals and very important goals, let's say to establish control over the northern part or to create the buffer zone. But I still don't understand the real purpose and the real value of Sporne on Siversk direction. Maybe the value is very big, but we can't understand this. Now let's move to Chasiv Yar. We have some small changes on the ground. And the Russians published the photo how they captured the church in the central part. I don't think that the church was captured by the Russians, because either the Russians and the Ukrainians tried to avoid the territory of churches. For example, in this video we can see the results of clashes and Russian strikes in the eastern Chasiv Yar. The eastern part, as you can see, was already reduced to ruins, and the most important is the final part. For example, in this part we can see the church. This is the church, and as you can see, the church completely wasn't damaged. Maybe there are some explosions where it took place around, but we see that church looks much better than any high-rise building in this area. So which confirms that most likely the Russians didn't enter the church, because it's not, let's call it, ethic from Russian and Ukrainian perspective. Now we're moving further. We have additional updates from the forests in the vicinity of Ivanovska. Today, pro-Ukrainian sources adjusted their maps, showing that this territory was captured by the Russians completely. Now we are moving further to Avdiivka area, where we received significant number of updates. We just discussed during the previous few days, we've been discussing the situation in Novoalexandrovka, yet we haven't received any geolocations confirming that the Russians established complete control, but most of the mappers have already adjusted their maps, showing additional Russian progress and that the entire village was captured. Probably the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation will announce about this tomorrow or the day after, but the most important that the Russians captured Novoalexandrovka because another Ukrainian group, another Ukrainian battalion, lost its combat capabilities and just decided to save their lives, and they abandoned their positions without letting know about this to the neighboring forces. So this is during this video we discussed a lot, we talk a lot about losses, and this is probably 4th or 5th battalion group of Ukrainian forces who have already lost its combat capabilities, and this is not the end, because now we're moving to Sokol, Vashod, Novosilovka, Persha, Novopokrovsky area, and as you can see, during the previous 24 hours we got significant number of geolocations, and most of them about another destroyed Ukrainian tank or armored vehicle or personnel carrier. I'll remind you that the situation become much worse and start worsening much faster after the Russians crossed the Babaki River, this one, and started, let's say, expanding their foothold in the north, let's say, western direction. We got additional confirmations from pro-Ukrainian mappers that the Russians captured this territory. Also, pro-Ukrainian mappers shows that the territory between, let's say, Novosilovka, Persha and this Russian foothold is already in the green zone. So this territory might be captured by the Russians already. But the thing is that the Ukrainians, as we discussed, appeared in operational encirclement in a small artillery pocket, because there are lots of rivers and lots of water barriers in this area, and most of the bridges were already destroyed by the Russians, let's say, since the beginning of this operation, since the beginning of the battle for this artillery pocket. Most of the bridges were destroyed. Most of the pontoon bridges are under complete Russian FPV drone and artillery control. So that's why the Ukrainians were trying to save and to keep their, let's say, armored vehicles and tanks hidden among the tree lines, fortifications, and many other constructions on the ground. And that allowed the Ukrainians to keep these vehicles saved and not destroyed by the Russians. But after the Russians crossed the Babaki River and the real risks of being encircled appeared, the Ukrainians decided to begin evacuation. For now, the Ukrainians tried to make this process controlled, not like just abandoning positions and running away through the mine fields and just fields. Now they just try to do this, let's say, with a centralized way. For example, we got a lot of videos how the Ukrainians were moving and running away from the line of combat contact, most important on the Western weapon, like Bradleys, like different strikers, and for example other different types of Western equipment. But as soon as the Ukrainians started moving, the Russians were hunting them and destroying them with FPV drones or missile strikes or artillery strikes. On this video we just seen the let's say destroyed Ukrainian Bradley. On this video we can see another attempt to evacuate and to run away from the line of combat contact on the Max Pro, but this armored personnel carrier was discovered by the Russians and destroyed during its movement to Novosilovka, Persha. A little bit further in the northern direction, we have another Bradley that was, or another tank, another Bradley that was damaged and destroyed by the Russians while the Bradley was trying to run away and to evacuate from this area. A bit further to the northwest, in the northwestern direction, in the north of Novoselov-Kopershe, we have the Abrams tanks that was doing the same. The Ukrainians were trying to run away, to move to the north, in the northern direction, or to the west, trying to abandon this artillery pocket, but the Abrams first was damaged by the Russian FPV drone, and then the Abrams was destroyed. Probably some of Ukrainian armored vehicles managed to escape this artillery pocket, but not so far. In this video, we can see another Hercules that was discovered by the Russian artillery forces, by the Russian reconnaissance teams, and as a result of artillery strike, that Hercules was destroyed. In the western direction, we have another Ukrainian tank that Ukrainians managed to hide between the tree lines, but the Russians discovered the tank, and as a result of accurate strike, the tank was destroyed. So if we increase the numbers of updates since the beginning of June, we're going to see significant number of icons of blue, let's say squares with a yellow skull inside of it, which confirms significant number of destroyed vehicles of Western production. And we know that most of this, let's say, equipment belonged to the 47th Mechanized Brigade, who is the core of defense in this direction. And to summarize everything, we can make a conclusion that most likely the 47th Mechanized Brigade is about to lose its combat capabilities as well. And if this brigade lose combat capabilities, then the situation is going to be very difficult for the Ukrainians, because I'm not sure who can replace them and who can become a core of defense in this direction. Now let's move to the south. We have Krasnogorovka. We continue receiving updates from the most eastern part. The Russian attempts to clear the eastern outskirts under very heavy fire of Ukraine FPV drones. This video just confirms the progress and that we colored the map yesterday. So nothing to change, just some regular activities in the eastern part. Georgievka, no updates, and now we're moving to Konstantinovka, because we had lots of very interesting details and updates from this territory as well. We continue receiving very interesting posts from the 79th Air Assault Brigade, because they are in panic. They're in panic. They don't know what to do, because this brigade is the core of defense of Konstantinovka, and they're saying that after the beginning of the Kharkiv offensive operation, most of their forces were redeployed to Kharkiv, and there is no manpower, no, let's say, weapon, no equipment, so they suffer significant losses, and they don't know how to stop the Russians. Furthermore, those posts of the type we got in the morning, but right before I start making the video, they published the final post, and they're saying that the 79th Brigade is about to lose also its combat capabilities. They're saying that in the 1st and 3rd Airborne Battalions, only 25-35% of the personnel remained. In the 2nd Battalion, things are worse. There is already less than 25% left. In the most militant Air Mobile Battalion since the beginning of 2014, since the beginning of the, let's say, counter operation from Ukrainian side, there are just over 350 specialists out of 80 left. So the common situation in battalion is that they have only 40%, even less, of the personnel from the original number and the number according to some standards. So this brigade is about to lose its combat capabilities as well, and after that nobody will be able to stop the Russians in their further movements, let's say in direction of Kurakhova. Of course, the Ukrainians try to solve the situation, and today we got report that they have redeployed Skala Assault Battalion, because for the Ukrainians, they don't have a lot of forces in this direction, and they need to choose what area is more important for them. And if to compare, let's say, Konstantinovka with these intersections of roads between Vadiano, Ugledar and Konstantinovka, the Ukrainians decided to send a reinforcement here, because the Russians were advancing in this direction significantly during the previous days. They managed to capture significant number of fields, to capture significant territories, to almost defeat the forces of 72nd mechanized brigade, and the Ukrainians have redeployed Skala assault battalion, and as soon as this battalion arrived in the area, the Ukrainians started a series of counterattacks in the northern direction of the main road, and in the southern direction as well. And as a result of those attacks, at least the Ukrainians managed to restore control over these three lines. I'm not sure whether the Ukrainians are able to hold this territory for a very long time. This tree line was captured by the Russians just a week ago. Now the Ukrainians managed to restore. Of course, this counterattack will not resolve the common situation, the problems in this area. Maybe the Ukrainians would be able to win some time, another day or another week, but as a result of such aggressive counterattacks, most likely this Skala assault battalion would be also defeated by the Russians in the very near future. They have already started suffering losses. In this video we can see how Skala battalion arrived on the line of combat contact, trying to make rotation or replace the Ukrainian forces or to prepare before further offensive, but the Russians, as a result of artillery strikes, destroyed that Ukrainian group. So, as you can see, the situation also is getting worse and worse. Urozhaina area, the pro-Ukrainian mappers have updated their maps, showing additional Russian progress in Staromayorska, and we have additional Russian progress in the south of Urozhaina. As you can see, we have adjusted the map. The Russians captured the southern part completely. Now the very heavy clashes are taking place exactly in the central part, which we were projecting during the previous few videos. And I'm not sure that the Ukrainians are able to hold this territory for a very long time, because it's very difficult to stay under very heavy Russian fire, under very heavy Russian, let's say, pressure without any resistance from Ukrainian artillery or Ukrainian rocket forces, because the main power of armed forces of Ukraine currently is concentrated in Kharkiv direction. We have the video of Russian attacks inside of the village, and the problem of Urozhaina is that there is just one more or less reliable defense belt, and we are talking about the northern part. And if Ukrainians lose the northern part, and obviously they are going to lose it, then we see a very big gap between Urozhaina and Velika Novoselovka itself. There are no more villages, just Blagodatne, but it's not something reliable. And if the Ukrainians leave Urozhaina, they will be forced to move very far to the in the northern direction, and most likely the Russians would be able to capture everything that located below this let's say white line, because the Ukrainians would have no possibilities to hold the Russian pressure. Rabotina, as of Rabotina we haven't received anything. As of Kherson we have just regular activity, FPV drone strikes, nothing more. Very interesting video we got from Kryvyi Rog. In this video we can see how the Russians, as a result of reconnaissance operation, managed to discover the position of Su-25, and as a result of Lancet strike, that Su-25 was destroyed. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.